The PlayStation ran on hardware that Sony designed in the early 90s. A 33 MHz processor, 2 megabytes of RAM, a GPU that couldn't do Z buffering properly, which is why every PS1 game has that characteristic polygon warping. By most reasonable metrics, it was a modest machine. And yet some developers looked at those constraints and found a way through them that shouldn't have been possible. This is about those games that did something with the PS1 that made engineers, developers, and players stop and ask, how? Alien Resurrection shipped in 2000 and was destroyed in reviews for its control scheme. GameSpot called the controls terrifying and disorienting, recommended players wait for Aliens Colonial Marines instead, a take that aged as badly as any in games journalism history, and described the configuration as something that would take extensive time to learn. What the game had implemented was the left analog stick for movement and the right analog stick for aiming, the exact configuration that every console first-person and third-person shooter has used for the last 25 years. The reviewers' confusion was about something that has since become muscle memory for anyone who plays games on a controller. The credit genuinely requires nuance. Medal of Honor, released in 1999, had this dual analog scheme available as preset for in its options menu. Present but buried, not default. GoldenEye on N64 had demonstrated that 2 analog inputs could handle FPS controls, but required 2 separate N64 controllers held together like Joy-Cons, which worked remarkably well, but was not a practical standard. Alien Resurrection made the dual analog scheme the default control option and built the entire game around it, which is the distinction that matters for its place in the history of the medium. The line from this game to Halo Combat Evolved, which finalized the scheme the following year, is direct. The game itself was a competent, licensed FPS that nobody would have remembered otherwise. The control scheme is why it matters, and the control scheme is running every console shooter made since 2001. Quake 2 on PC in 1997 was a 60 frames per second, hardware-accelerated experience built for machines with dedicated 3D accelerator cards that cost as much as a console by themselves. The PS1 port, released in 1999 by Hammerhead, ran on the 33 MHz processor with no hardware 3D acceleration and a DualShock controller. It ran at 30 frames per second. In that context, 30 frames per second was an achievement that most developers who studied the conversion opportunity concluded was not practically achievable. The gap between what Quake 2 required and what the PS1 could provide was assessed as too wide to bridge without destroying what made the game work. The port required aggressive polygon reduction throughout, compressed draw distances that introduced a fog layer not present on PC, and reduced enemy counts per area to remain within processor limits. The PC soundtrack was compressed from CD audio quality. Despite all of those concessions, what arrived was recognizably Quake 2. The same maps, the same weapons, the same movement feel, the same fundamental encounter rhythm that made the original compelling. Hammerhead redesigned map pacing to account for shortened visibility, which converted the fog from a limitation into an atmospheric element that suited the game's aesthetic. The AI behavioral patterns were retained even where model complexity was reduced, which preserved the gameplay loop's essential character. Enemy silhouettes remained readable within the fog. As a demonstration that the PS1 could run software was never conceived to support, this is still one of the more impressive porting efforts in the console's history. Driver 2 shipped in 2000 and ran really badly. Frame rates collapsing into single digits during dense city sequences. The hardware visibly struggling to process the scene in real time as the draw calls exceeded what the system could service. And yet what Reflections Interactive had managed to fit onto that disc was genuinely extraordinary. For fully realized 3D open-world cities, Chicago, Havana, Las Vegas, and Rio de Janeiro, with the ability for the first time in the series to exit the car and walk around on foot. Rendering open 3D cities on PS1 hardware was already beyond what most developers attempted. adding pedestrian exploration, character animations, collision detection systems, and building access on the same hardware during the same runtime was a different order of demand entirely. The frame rate problem is real, and it is significant. Driver 2 is almost unplayable in the densest city segments, and the original Driver had avoided this by keeping geometry sparse and the camera perspective tight. Driver 2 refused both of those compromises, and the PS1 couldn't sustain what was being asked of it cleanly. What Reflections proved was a concept that GTA 3 would execute successfully on PS2 the following year. Open cities as fully navigable living spaces rather than obstacle courses dressed to look like cities. The ambition preceded the hardware that could execute it without breaking. Reflections got there first, paid for it in frame rate, and established what the next generation of hardware would make possible at a playable standard. The broken version still demonstrated the idea, which is why the industry paid attention. Tekken 3 was an arcade game running on Namco's System 12 board. Dedicated polygon rendering hardware designed specifically for high-quality fighting games in commercial cabinets. Porting it to the PS1 was widely considered unrealistic by developers outside Namco's internal team. What shipped in 1998 ran at a locked 60 frames per second, and that number was the entire project's non-negotiable requirement. Competitive fighting games don't function below 60 frames per second. The timing windows that define skilled play depend on consistent frame delivery, and a fighting game dropping frames is mechanically broken regardless of how it looks when nothing is happening. Every single decision made during the port served one goal: hold that frame rate. Character polygon counts were reduced from the arcade versions, stage backgrounds were simplified with shortened draw distances, and certain character animations were reduced in frame count. With all of those concessions fully accepted, the game held 60 frames per second and felt like Tekken 3 in the ways that mattered. The hit detection, the move priority, the frame data that competitive players had memorized from the arcade. Namco's years of PS1 development before this title, Tekken 1 and 2, Ridge Racer, Ace Combat, and others had given their internal engineers an understanding of the hardware architecture that most outside studios simply didn't have. They knew where CPU cycles existed that other developers hadn't located. The resulting port was the closest the PS1 ever came to arcade perfect in the fighting genre. Achieved on hardware the arcade original was never designed to support, at the frame rate the genre required to remain a legitimate competitive experience. Gran Turismo 2 simulated physics for 650 cars on a PS1 processor. The number needs to be held carefully. Not an approximation of physics, not an abstracted model that produced car-shaped handling behavior, but a simulation of tire friction coefficients, suspension travel, weight transfer under braking, and power delivery curves across 650 individual vehicle models, each with its own handling profile built from real manufacturer data that was perceptibly different at the wheel when you switched between classes of car. When 3 shipped on PS2 hardware 8 times more powerful, it launched with 150 cars, a quarter of the number. The optimization work Polyphony Digital built into the original PlayStation to make the sequel function at this scale remains among the most sophisticated software engineering the platform produced. The game required 2 discs, arcade and simulation, because the full car roster and track data couldn't fit on one disc and be simultaneously accessible. The Polyphony team had spent 4 years on the original, building a physics framework optimized for every available CPU cycle, and this expanded that foundation while nearly quadrupling the car count. The result was a game that genuinely felt different depending on which of those 650 cars you chose. The understeer of a front-wheel drive city car versus the snap-oversteer of a tuned rear-wheel drive sports car was a real and learnable distinction that players developed driving instincts to manage over time. Silent Hill in 1999 did something no other horror game had done. It turned hardware failure into design. Every PS1 game had draw distance limits. Every PS1 game generated fog to hide geometry that the hardware couldn't render far enough to display cleanly. Developers generally tried to minimize or disguise this limitation. Konami's Team Silent decided it was the game. Fog became fog, a narrative element, a physical property of the town of Silent Hill, a constant reminder that something was wrong with this place and with Harry Mason's ability to perceive it. The radio static that warned of approaching monsters was similarly motivated by hardware. It was cheaper to trigger sound than to render monster geometry from a distance, and became atmospheric. The result is a game where the technical limitations of the platform are completely indistinguishable from the art direction, where the things the PS1 couldn't do became the things that made Silent Hill unique. The creature designed by Masahiro Ito existed within a visual field that the hardware constrained to a tight radius, making every encounter claustrophobic in a way a technically capable platform would have undermined. The game's soundtrack by Akira Yamauchi combined industrial noise and ambient texture in ways the PS1 audio chip handled well, because Yamauchi understood it. Konami's other hardware constraint as design move was the game's transition to the other world, the rusted, hellish version of the town, which the PS1 could render with the same geometry as the normal version, just relit and retextured. Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, shipped in 1999 with no loading screens. None. Not a single one across an entire interconnected 3D open world. On a PlayStation with a CD drive so slow that most games had to load every individual room. Crystal Dynamics built a custom data streaming engine that continuously fed geometry and textures off the disc in real time as Raziel moved through the world, seamlessly replacing what was behind him with what lay ahead. Director Amy Hennig described it as the single biggest technical challenge of the entire project. They were still fighting to get texture streaming working correctly just months before the game released, and it nearly didn't make it. The world also tracked everything. A weapon used to kill an enemy stayed on the floor where it fell. A moved block stayed moved. The persistent state of every object was maintained across the entire world for the entire run. Then there was realm shifting, real-time morphing of the geometry between the material world and the spectral realm, achieved by attaching spectral coordinates to each vertex in the 3D Max timeline and interpolating between frame 0 and frame 1. The result was a world that visually twisted as Raziel passed between planes, with no load event, no cutscene cover. The PS1 version ran slower than the Dreamcast port, with frame rate drops the later platform didn't suffer. But the streaming engine, the core technical achievement, was built for and debuted on that original Sony hardware. Naughty Dog and Crystal Dynamics were solving the same problem simultaneously. Both made it work. Metal Gear Solid on PS1 in 1998 redefined what a video game could do with story and did on hardware, where Konami was shipping the script across 2 discs because one couldn't hold it. Kojima brought cinematic production techniques to a medium that had barely started treating its own narrative seriously. The codec conversations, hours of optional and mandatory dialogue between Snake and his support team, established character, world, and theme in ways that most games of the era didn't attempt. Boss fights were narrative chapters as much as gameplay encounters. The torture sequence with genuine player agency, where the outcome changes with your resistance. Sniper Wolf's extended death scene shot as deliberately as any film sequence. The final exchange with Big Boss. Psycho Mantis demands specific attention. A boss who had read your memory card, commented on the specific games you played, made the controller vibrate to demonstrate his telepathic abilities, and could only be defeated by physically moving your controller to the second player port, so he couldn't read your inputs. This was meta-narrative design operating at a scale most developers still haven't attempted. Kojima built a game around free will versus genetic determinism, the ethics of nuclear deterrence, and what it costs to be a soldier who follows orders without question, and he rendered this as a spy thriller with excellent stealth mechanics and one of the best soundtracks on the system. The gap between what Metal Gear Solid was doing and what most games around it were doing in 1998 was not small.
So they just close the lid and try to pretend like
Castlevania Symphony of the Night arrived in 1997 when most developers were abandoning 2D entirely for polygons. The PS1's commercial identity was built on its 3D capabilities, and the industry consensus was that sprite-based games were finished as a platform for serious development. Koji Igarashi made an argument in the other direction. Redirect the resources the platform could theoretically spend on pre-rendered 3D toward 2D sprite work, character animation depth, and audio production instead, and the result would be something no 3D game on the system could approach visually or sonically. The argument was correct. Alucard's sprite sheet contains over 1,500 frames of animation across his complete move set, an elaboration no other 2D game on the PS1 matched. The castle spans over 1,000 hand-designed, interconnected rooms, each with a distinct visual identity, forming a Metroidvania maze before the term existed. Michiru Yamane's soundtrack set the aesthetic ceiling for 2D action game music for the following decade. The inverted castle, the mirrored second half of the game, revealed when players followed a specific sequence at the first castle's conclusion, doubled the content, and communicated that the game had been restraining itself. Enemy designs drew from medieval art history, religious iconography, and classical mythology with a specificity most games treated as surface decoration, but Symphony of the Night used as coherent character logic. It shipped, reviewed well, but not spectacularly, sold modestly, and the re-evaluation that began almost immediately as it never stopped. Parasite Eve is what happened when Squaresoft applied Final Fantasy VII production resources to a horror RPG about mitochondrial cellular mutation set across 5 days in New York City. The real-time battle system was genuinely unusual for a Square game in 1998. Enemies moved independently, while Aya Brea's action timer filled, requiring active repositioning before committing to attacks rather than waiting for a turn prompt, and the Parasite energy system gave her mitochondrial abilities, spontaneous combustion, cellular manipulation, biological regeneration, drawing from a resource pool entirely separate from weapon-based combat. It occupied a design space between action game and RPG that felt like neither category had fully claimed it. The pre-rendered backgrounds applied the PS1's rendering capabilities to a visual register distinct from Final Fantasy VII's painterly fantasy environments. The Metropolitan Opera House, the Museum of Natural History, Carnegie Hall, real New York locations rendered with architectural precision and relit for horror, familiar spaces made threatening through lighting rather than distortion. The FMV production matched the quality ceiling Final Fantasy VII had established as the platform benchmark. The writing, adapted from Hideaki Senna's novel, engaged with actual mitochondrial biology at a level of rigor unusual in a genre where science typically functions as window dressing for things that were going to happen anyway. Squaresoft treated it as a flagship release and committed production resources accordingly. The film tie-in that released simultaneously was entirely nominal. The game was its own complete work with a sequel and a lasting critical reputation the film never came close to generating. Final Fantasy IX arrived in 2000 as the console's commercial life was ending and pushed the hardware to a place it had never been, and in a meaningful sense, couldn't go past. The pre-rendered backgrounds had always been the signature approach for the PS1 Final Fantasy games. Paint-level detailed environments, characters animated on top of them, the illusion of depth through careful perspective work. Final Fantasy IX took this method and drove it to the mathematical ceiling of what the rendering pipeline could produce. The background art is so detailed that individual tiles, cloth textures, and stonework remain stunning viewed at native resolution today. The FMV sequences push the FMV codec bandwidth to its absolute limit. The Memoria sequence in the final act, the Terra flashback sequences, and the ending These are sequences where the compression artifacts visible in most PS1 FMVs are nearly absent because the team had found every available optimization. Character models on the field and battle maps ran at the highest polygon counts the system could sustain without frame drops. The transition from overworld to village to battle arena to FMV was the smoothest the Final Fantasy PS1 trilogy ever achieved. The game was also designed as a deliberate tribute to the franchise's earlier entries. A JRPG made in full knowledge that the platform era it was closing was about to end. That awareness is written into the design, from the medieval setting to the character archetypes to the score, which is the most orchestrally ambitious the PS1 audio chip was asked to produce. Vagrant Story came out in 2000, the final year of the PS1's commercial life, and it is the most technically impressive game the hardware ever ran. The development team was the Final Fantasy Tactics team, people whose primary experience was in 2D pixel art, who had never shipped a fully 3D game. They approached 3D modeling with 2D artist instincts, mapping textures with pixel-perfect discipline onto geometrically simple models, and the results surpassed what teams with more 3D experience were producing on the same hardware. Ashley Riot's character model, against all logic given the constraint of under 500 triangles per character, animates with detailed mouth movements and eye tracking. Facial expressions were achieved through 32 by 32 pixel sprite textures with subpixel shading. The lighting system shouldn't have existed on PS1 at all. The team layered two differently shaded versions of the same character model on top of each other to create pseudo-shadow effects. A technique so subtle it's only visible when examined closely in HD. Seamless transitions between gameplay and cutscene use the identical character models throughout, eliminating the jarring model swap most PS1 games had to accept. Lead programmer Taku Murata wrote a custom polygon culling system that tracked which surfaces could be rendered partially, saving memory for surfaces the camera would always see completely. Hideo Kojima saw the game and was reportedly jealous of the technical work. It represents a category of achievement that has nothing to do with brute force and everything to do with artists and engineers understanding their constraints at a level nobody else on the platform reached.